Okay, so if you are writing a story, you are going to need to think about the parts of a story, obviously, when you're brainstorming. So you should have already made your flow map and submitted it on Canvas, and I've given you some feedback on that, which you'll look at in a little bit. But I want to just review the parts of a story really quickly and make sure that you've thought about those things when you're creating your story map. So I think that this should look pretty familiar to you guys. Something like that, right? A story map that's written like that. I think you're probably pretty familiar with it, but I want to review exactly what that is just as a reminder, okay? So when you sit down to write a story, we want to kind of think about a roller coaster when we're plotting out the events in our story. So the first part of a story is what we call the exposition, okay? And the exposition obviously includes the word expose, so we want to think of that as a clue. But the exposition is going to include or expose three main things, okay? The first thing that we're going to learn about are the characters, or maybe character because it's such a short story. We need to learn about the setting, where and when is the story taking place, and the conflict will also be revealed to us. So when you look at your own flow map, do you have a setting that's established? And is it, described, okay? Do you have some characters and do you have a conflict? The next part of our story is called the rising action, okay? And the rising action is where the events in the story start to build, okay? The action and the suspense starts to build. So you might have multiple things that happen leading up to the climax. So you might have 4 events. Because this is such a short story, you might only have a few events, okay? You do not necessarily need to have that many events. So the third part of our story is called the climax. And the climax is at this very, very top of our roller coaster. And it is the most suspenseful part of the story, or the turning point, okay? So the turning point, what I mean when I say that is, it's the part in the story when the character is sort of at a crossroads. They could choose to make a decision, okay? They might be torn between which decision to make. They might be confronting a problem head on, okay? But that is the point in the story where a character is going to determine how this is going to end for them. Okay? And your story may not be the suspenseful story, but for example, if you're writing a story about Johnny deciding whether he's going to go to college or not, maybe the height of suspense in your story is when he's arguing with his parents. Okay, that might be your climax. So that is part 3. So let me write that. So the fourth part of a story is called the falling action. Okay, and the falling action, just like the name implies, is when the action starts to kind of wind down. So for example, if the climax of the story is Johnny arguing with his parents, maybe the falling action is when he goes into his room and kind of decompresses for a minute, and maybe he picks up the phone and calls a friend, okay? Your resolution is part 5, and that is where the conflict is resolved and kind of loose ends are wrapped up. Now, your story doesn't need to necessarily have a happy ending, but this is kind of where you're going to give readers a glimpse into what would happen later on or what has happened. It doesn't have to necessarily be a happy ending, but all the loose ends should be tied up. So what I'd like you to do right now, and these directions are given to you in the folder that you have in front of you, you are going to open up your own flow map, and I'd like you to label your events in your flow map as either exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, or resolution. Each event should have a label, but you might have, for example, 5 pieces of rising action and only 1 falling action. That's perfectly fine, okay? Or maybe you have 1 of each because this is such a short story. Remember, in your exposition, you need to have these 3 things. So in your exposition, if you do not have a setting that's developed, include that. If you do not have character that are developed, include that. And if you do not have a conflict, you need to include that. As a reminder, setting should be time and place, okay? And do you need to say the story takes place in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Or can you show us where it's taking place by giving us some description? Give it some thought and good luck.